Welcome back. You're still tuned in to News and Views of myself, Salailo Makudire. The time is 8:37, and you're still tuned in to your home of humanitarian journalism, Salam Media. And we're going to be having an interesting conversation. I saw it fitting that we have it because we just wrapped up Africa Month just a few days ago, a time that's meant to celebrate our unity as a continent, our cultures, and our progress. But behind the colorful flags and the celebratory slogans, I think we can all agree lies a very, very sobering truth when it comes to the continent. Africa is bleeding in silence. In Sudan, there's a brutal civil war that rages on. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, a conflict that South Africans know all well too that know all too well, where there are millions that are being displaced. You have a situation in Burkina Faso and the Sahel region where terror is literally emptied entire villages, and yet some of these crises are barely mentioned in global headlines or even our own. I mean, when was the last time you heard or read anything about what's happening in the DRC outside of the SANDF being there? Or Sudan, for instance. It is said to be the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, with the most displaced number of people anywhere in the world. But when was the last time you saw it on the news? This kind of neglect isn't just humanitarian, and to many levels, also intellectual. It's strategic. It's as if Africa is not allowed to think for itself, speak to itself, or act in its own defense. And one space that tried to challenge that was the Tana High Level Forum. Founded back in 2012, it was a Pan African platform for leaders, for scholars, and for civil society to come together and shape African led solutions. And over time, it feels and looks like it has weakened. It has been undermined by external funders with their own agendas, which is always the case when it comes to Africa, and abandoned by the African Union to almost timid levels, if I can put it that way. Now, voices like Orapeleng Matshediso, research associate at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, are calling for the revival of the Tana Forum and the launch of African Renaissance clubs, championed, by the likes of Thabo Mbeki, by the likes of Julius Nyerere, and their foundations. The goal? Well, to rebuild the intellectual muscle of the continent and to try and restore spaces where Africa can think and act for itself. So, as we reflect on the end of Africa Month, maybe the real question is, can we afford not to listen to each other and stop listening to ourselves, maybe? Orapeleng Matshediso joins us now to discuss why this revival of the continent is urgent and how reclaiming African agency starts with thought, memory, and action. Orapeleng, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Salam Media. Always a pleasure having you on air.
Yeah, no, good morning, Selailo and the listeners of Salam Media.
Orapeleng, I think we can kickstart the conversation with where we are now when it comes to issues of the continent. I mentioned that Africa Month, we just wrapped it up a few days ago, and we're wrapping it up at a time where the continent is again facing some of the worst humanitarian crises in years, from Sudan, DRC, as I mentioned, to the Sahel region and what's happening in that part of the world, and even close by here in Mozambique. Um, what does it say about the state of Pan-Africanism today, everything that's happening? And why are these crises largely being ignored, not just by the world, which is expected at this point, but by Africans internally, ourselves?
Yeah, no, Selailo, thank you very much. I think it is important, first and foremost, to foreground this conversation with this important information that globally Africa accounts for 70% of the conflicts. Secondly, globally again, Africa accounts for more than 70% of the refugees and displaced population. Now, it is important also to say, as we reflect on this important fact, factor with regard to the humanitarian aid and why there is no sufficient intervention coming to the fore. It is important, first and foremost, to say it is an indicative of the fact that African leaders have not been able to live up to the dream of the of their forebears, particularly those who formed the Organization of African Unity 62 years ago, with the agenda to ensure that Africa developed an economy that is self-reliant. Now, this humanitarian assistance and poor humanitarian aid that we see with many countries, of course, withholding, countries such as US, Belgium, France, and so on and so forth, withholding their humanitarian aid to the continent, and the continent being unable to fund itself. It's a clear indication that there's never been enough Pan-African agenda of making sure that a self-economic, political, and cultural reliance is achieved. And one would also say that we must also understand that on the continent, the issue of hegemony and counter-hegemony has not been sufficiently canvassed on the ground, because we still have Africans who see themselves as more Western, and those Africans who see themselves as Pan-Africanist, and those who do not actually care of what is happening on the continent. Those are the indicative that the leadership has not been able to drive a Pan-Africanist agenda. But I also argue in the recent article that I wrote that I think in 2018, African Union did not do justice by merging the Political Affairs Commission with the Peace and Security Commission. Because now with the 70% of that Africa accounts for globally in respect to the issues of conflict, it therefore means that commission will be immersed with the responsibility to ensure that there is a peace and security. But the unfortunate part is that what is going to suffer is the political affairs that's supposed to be driving the revival of Pan-Africanist agenda on the continent.
I wanna focus on that article, the recent one that you wrote for the IOL, and I think is very, very insightful and interesting to read. You argue for the revival of the Tana High Level Forum. For listeners who might not be familiar, what was the Tana Forum's original purpose? What is it, and why was it such a critical space for African dialogue and African discourse?
Most importantly, without wasting much of time, of course, the Tana Forum was a response to the summit of African Union that was held in Tripoli in Libya 2009, that after the leadership or the heads of state on the continent assessed the state of conflict, peace and security, and they resolved that there's a need for African-centered and African-centered led solution to the problems of peace and security on the continent. And later, of course, the Tana Forum in 2012 was established as the platform for engagement of African heads of state and decision makers on the continent to give the conflict resolution a Pan-Africanist architecture in terms of what should be African-centered led conflict resolution and peace building. And of course, Tana Forum started very well with only 6 funders and sponsors, mainly being the Ethiopian entities and Ethiopian government. But unfortunately, along the process, it lost its own agency because of major funders who came with the agenda. I mean, by 2022, when the Tana Forum was 10 years old, it had 26 funders, but it was no longer as impactful as when it started. So it shows that these partners, they've got a certain agenda to drive, to derail African agenda that, of course, seeks to make sure that there is a conflict-free continent, because most of them, they benefit from some of the insurgencies, some of the instabilities that are taking place on the continent, because they want to determine the agenda and who should lead on various African countries, and that is a problem. I would also want to tell you that, of course, after that 10 years, we experienced a situation wherein Tana Forum was losing the quality debates from an African perspective agenda, because they organized parallel programs, because to them they wanted to use that Tana Forum to project themselves and market their interest at the expense of Africa's interest. So that was the only challenge that we had. I mean, even to date, the fact that humanitarian aid is a crisis, that there is a crisis of humanitarian aid on the continent. It's precisely because what we see, or they pronounce themselves as non-profit organization or non-governmental actors, they are acting at the interest of a particular countries, particularly the so-called Western countries, to project their agenda on the continent. You would remember that when the Organization of African Unity then came with the agenda called the Lagos Plan of Action, which was in the main positioning Africa to have its own governance that will create that self-economic, political, and cultural self-reliance. The so-called Bretton Woods institutions, your IMF and World Bank, came with the structural adjustment program, which of course was fermenting new colonialism within the continent, so that African leaders should see a liberal agenda as the only alpha and omega to our as only alpha and omega to our governance challenges. But in fact, that did not assist in anyhow. You would also remember the recent situation that took place in the Sahel region, where African leaders, particularly in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, took a decision to actually divorce themselves from the colonial hand of the former colonial master France. One people on the ground, they see themselves as Sankarists, where they want to finish what Thomas Sankara, the former president of Burkina Faso, has started. But in the view of African Union, they had to terminate the membership of those particular states, because the template set for African Union is that the only means of attaining power, it is through democratic processes defined by the West. I'm not saying I'm against elected leadership, but I'm saying you've got also to understand that even if when you say the leadership must be through process of elected by the electorate, you need also to check the political psychology or the indebted colonial political psychology in the minds of many of Africans, who would not see the Pan-Africanist agenda as the solution, because they see themselves more as West. They mirror themselves as West than Africans.
Mm-hmm. You know, as I'm listening to you speak, I'm just thinking to myself, isn't all of this supposed to be happening at the Pan-African Parliament? Aren't they supposed to be, the hosts of such discourse when it comes to what's happening in and around the continent? But then I refer to your article where you say, fora like the Tan High Level Forum have been more effective than the Pan-African Parliament. Why is there failure? Why is there failure from the Pan-African Parliament? Why is it not doing what it is intended to do? I mean, I don't remember any kind of tangible, meaningful, action that came from the Pan-African Parliament that seek to remedy the state of the continent. Is there still a need for the Pan-African Parliament?
Yeah, no, I still agree that there's still need for Pan-African Parliament in as much as I argue that it's not as much as effective as it's supposed to be, particularly in championing the agenda of making sure that there is a Pan-Africanist awareness, people to people engagement, because the challenge with many of this Africa's agenda, from Lagos Plan of Action, New Partnership for Africa's Development, it is because they have been more leader-centric as opposed to people. That is why when certain leaders, leaders such as the former president of Nigeria, Obasanjo, President Thabo Mbeki, who played critical role in assisting to revive the Organization of African Unity through the establishment of the African Union. When they left, this Pan-Africanist agenda get a lukewarm support from many of these heads of states that came after them. It is because the Pan-Africanist Parliament is leader-centric in approach, as opposed to engage and make sure that this Pan-Africanist agenda reaches the grounds and be inculcated in the minds of Africans to understand why Africa has always been underpinned by solidarity, supporting each other as Africans, understanding where we come from, our shared vision, our shared history of slavery and colonialism. So the Pan-Africanist Parliament has not been able to reach the ground. It is more of a formal engagement amongst leaders. They leave, they will see agenda again, but there is no concerted effort to make sure that it goes to the people on the ground and be a true reflection of the people's parliament. I mean, you would ask I will make a practical example on the question that I still pose to many. Are many of African parliaments, including Pan-Africanist Parliament, a true reflection and the career of the aspirations of the people? Let's take example of recently what happened last year in Kenya, with the finance bill. The consultation was done in Kenya with regard to finance bill. The Kenyans rejected that. The parliament still continued to endorse the proposal that was rejected by the majority of the Kenyans during the consultation. But they decided to take the mandate from IMF, because IMF had given them a template to say this is how much they've got to pay towards their servicing their debts. And they had to do that through increasing value-added tax and so on and so forth to get those particular resources to service their debts. So it shows that Pan-Africanist Parliament and many of parliaments on the continent, they are far away from the people. That is why I'm saying Tana Forum remains the critical point of convergence for resuscitation of the Pan-Africanist agenda and grooming of new thought leaders who would drive the Africa's Agenda 2063 with diligence and dedication.
Lastly, before I let you go, there's a line that really, bothered me as I was reading your article, and it was okay. Let me just quote it. It was one of the more powerful lines in your piece. You said, and I'm quoting, Africa is more dependent today than it was at the dawn of independence. And that really hit me. I asked myself so many questions, but if you can just expand a bit on that view, and what you think the root causes of this regression essentially are.
Yeah, no. In fact, if you read that article, I was even arguing that is the statement that was also made by a panelist at the Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture in Tanzania on the 24th of May, on the occasion of celebrating the Africa Day. The panelist raised this important question to say, Africa is more dependent than it was after independence. And I think you can even look at what is happening with regard to the humanitarian aid that after US, Belgium, France, and many of these so-called superpower countries withheld their funds towards Africa. There is a serious challenge of increasing unemployment. The situation is deteriorating. That on its own, it shows that African leaders have not been able, 62 years of the existence since the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, there has never been sufficient economic transformation to ensure that our continent is self-reliant, to can be able to carry its own project. Every project that comes, we must rely on the funders from the former colonizers. That on its own, it shows the extent of our dependency. And that is why I'm saying we are even more, because you would remember that 10 years of post-independence, the economy of our continent was, to a certain extent, coming together, was growing. Up until a hand of the former colonizers came back through structural adjustment program, with the hand that fermented the new colonialism. And with this new colonial agenda, we are unable to sufficiently fund our own programs. I mean, Tana Forum was the greatest initiative. It lacked funds to extent that the West came to it, fund it, to derail it. And that on its own, it shows that indeed we are in trouble. I will make the last example with regard to what the article from Al Jazeera said with regard to this humanitarian crisis that go unforeseen. It argues that there is no effective conflict resolution and then post-conflict reconstruction and development on these particular countries that are identified as invincible humanitarian crisis. It argues that there is no effective. And I will tell you, it's because many of African leaders, they rely more on the template given by the so-called superpowers, the first world countries, as they are called. They come with template to say, for conflict, what needs to happen is that for conflict resolution is peacekeeping. After peacekeeping, there must be negotiation. After negotiations, there must be power sharing. And from there, institutions are built in exclusion of the indigenous people on the continent to can be able to input on this peace agreement that are signed. That on its own, it shows that the African leaders are reliant on the template transplanted from the West to the continent for their own conflict resolution and post-conflict reconstruction and development.
No, definitely. Orapeleng Matshediso, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure having you. And yeah, really appreciate your insights on the continent. I think anyone that needs to check out that article, please head over to the IOL website. It's really, really interesting and eye-opening. And I hope we chat again in the not so distant future.
Thank you very much.
Orapeleng Matshediso, research associate at the University of Johannesburg, and yeah, really offering some really wonderful sides. When it comes to the continent of Africa and the regress. I think that's what's striking for me, that we were at a better place just after independence, when that yoke and the shackles of colonialism were down and released. It seemed there was progress, but we are at a far more worse place than we were at that point as a continent. And yeah, man, it's something to think about. We're going to take a quick break. News and views continues after this.